Hey everyone, I just wanted to give you guys a quick video, some of the introductory concepts on object-oriented programming, especially creating a new class in your project and then creating an instance of that class. I'm working in Visual Studio on a Mac just because I've had a lot of questions this semester on the Mac. What you're doing in Windows should be even a little easier, and you should be able to follow along as is. I'll point out a couple places where it might differ just a little bit. Okay, so I've created a project. It's just a basic project called class example, and it's got the default program.cs. I haven't changed anything at this point. So let's add a new class, and to do that, an easy way in both Windows and on Windows or the Mac is to use the Solution Explorer. So here I have Solution Explorer open. If you didn't see that, you'd go to View, and on the Mac it's Pads, Solution. I believe in Windows it's View Solution Explorer, and in the Windows version it would open on the right side. So what you'll see is a list of all of the folders and files in your project. The first is a folder for the actual solution, then is the project, and then inside the project all of our files. So here's an easy way to create a class on both. Go to the Solution Explorer, right-click on the project, and say Add New File. Now, in the Windows version, there's actually an option at the very bottom to add a class, and it opens up the same dialog. It just has the right option already selected for you. So I'm going to select Empty Class, and I'll go ahead and call it Book. I know I'm giving away a little bit of the last lab. I think that's okay. So what it does is it adds a new file called book.cs, and here's the source code file open in the editor window. You can see that it's got this public class book statement, and inside there's already a method, and this is an empty constructor method. Now I don't believe the Windows version creates this explicitly. I think it leaves it out. I could be wrong. That could be a .NET Core edition. But basically an empty constructor method means it's a constructor method with no parameters, so we're not sending in any values. And you'll notice one thing from the standard methods that we've been creating from the methods lesson is that there's no return type. I mean, this would not be a valid method, except for the fact that the name of the method matches the class exactly. So this is a specialized method. It's the constructor method. And constructor methods never take return types, so we just leave that out. We don't need the keyword void, and we're obviously not returning any specific values. Okay, so let's do this. When we compare program.cs and book.cs, there's one main difference. You'll notice that book and program both have this using system namespace. That's because of the type of project it is, so that again we can use that console.readline, console.writeline to output values. They both have the same namespace, and that's because we're creating this within the same solution, and the namespace is just a way to organize the files so that they can work together. So they're both residing in this folder called class example. You'll notice that the name of the class matches the file name, so book.cs matches book. Now, it's not a rule that the class inside of the file has to match the file name, but it is a good practice just to keep things organized. In fact, we could put the book class right in here alongside class program. We could do that. But it is nice to have them in separate files just as a way to organize the classes. Once you add 100 different classes into a project, it makes it much easier if they're organized into files. Now, there's one main difference between book and program.cs, or the book and program class, and that is that program has this specialized method that we've been using all semester. So you guys know that the main method is the starting point for our program. It's where when we run the program from the command prompt, it starts right inside the main method. So that makes program a runnable file. program is a runnable file. Book, however, does not have a main method, and we don't want to add a main method. Book is essentially a new type that we're adding. You might call it a user-defined type. So just like we've been creating variables of int and string and double, our class book is a new type, and instead of creating a variable, we're going to create an object of type book. So we'll create a new object, and it can hold multiple values. So let's go ahead and add some properties. That's how we store values inside of our user-defined type. So we'll create a variable called author and title. How about a double value for price and maybe an ISBN. And notice we're declaring the variable the same way we do a simple variable inside of our program. However, it's got this keyword public in front of it, and we call that an access modifier. And there are 3 different values that we can assign to a property for an access modifier: public, private, and protected. And what that determines is where this property can be used. So if it's public, it can be used anywhere. So when we create an instance of book inside program.cs, we can access ISBN, author, title, and price because they're all public. If we made ISBN private, now we can only access this inside of the book class itself. So inside this code is the only place that we can access ISBN. So let's do this. Let's create, let me tell you the last one. Protected has to do with inheritance. So if you read about inheritance later on, if we create a more specific type of book, so say we made a electronic book or an ebook class, and we inherited all of the functionality of class book, and if we made ISBN protected, then it could be used inside of this class code, and it could be used inside of the ebook class code. So that's a little more advanced, so if you didn't understand that, don't worry about it until you get to inheritance. Okay, so we've got this private ISBN property and 3 public properties, an empty constructor method, and our class is called book. Let's go ahead and jump over to program.cs, and now we'll create an instance of book, or another way to say that is a book object. Okay, so notice that book is the lowercase form of the class name. Does it have to be that? And the answer is no. It could be book 1. It could be my book. They'll all work just fine. So we'll call it book just to keep things simple. And then when we have this object now called book, book has 4 properties in it: ISBN, author, price, and title. And you'll notice that we're inside of the main method in class program. We have access to all of the properties that we made public. And believe it or not, the dot has a fancy name in programming. We call it the access operator. Access operator. And the access operator allows us to access anything that we can view from this point. So because we made author public, we can access it from this point. Notice ISBN does not exist in the list, and that's because we made it private. And this is a double value, right? Okay, so at this point our program's not going to output anything if we run it, but we can run it and see that we can see that we have access to the properties. So inside of our when we're inside of our program class and we're looking at locals, we will see our book object, and we'll see all of the properties that are publicly accessible. So here we have book author, and we just assigned the value title. And as we step through these lines of code, you'll see it's assigning value. So now title is Intro to C#, and so on. Okay, so let's add a method now. So remember, a method starts with our access modifiers at public or private. And then we have the return type. In this case, let's just return the value of the title. So we'll call it get title. And we'll just return the value of title. Now, I'm prefixing it with this dot. I'll explain that in a little bit. And then let's add a set title. And this one we're going to send in, oh, sorry, it's not going to return anything. This time we're going to send in a value called title. And we're going to say this dot title equals title. Okay, so two methods, and they should look pretty familiar to this point. So we have our access modifier. This is our return type. Remember, there's three ways to return, right? Return with a value, an empty return statement if it doesn't return anything at all. So in this case, we could say return, and that would be valid. Or it's not returning anything and it just encounters the end of the method. So three different ways to return. Notice that in this case, we're sending in a parameter called title, and title matches identically the name of a property. So how do we differentiate between the parameter that we're sending into the method and the property of the class? Well, the way we do that is we prefix it with this dot. So anytime we prefix a property or a method with this dot, it means it's part of the class. It's defined within the class. Anytime we send in a parameter that's named the same thing as a property of the class, it's going to override it. So anytime we refer to just title inside of this method, it's referring to the parameter. And I love this feature of Visual Studio. If you double click on one of the properties, it shows you all of the other instances of that identifier or variable inside of the local scope it's in. So here we see title is referring to the title for the parameter. And if we double click on this dot title, it shows you all of the other instances in the class, and it's referring to the property. So basically, all a setter is doing, and this is not the C# getter setter syntax you may have run into. This is kind of just a traditional setter method, but in this case, all a setter method's doing is we're sending in a value and we're assigning it to a property. Okay, and same thing with the get method. All we're doing is we're calling a method that returns the value of one of the properties. And why would we have methods to do this when we could just say, inside of our program.cs, we could just say book.title and get the property right away? Well, maybe you find out later on that you don't want to return this title. Maybe, I don't know what the circumstance for a book would be. Maybe it's got an explicit word in it, or maybe you want to change the language output in a specific way. Well, if we use a method to return it, then we can modify it however we want inside of the method before we return it. So it adds some real flexibility, not only right now, but if we need to change our code later on down the road. So it's a really good practice to use getters and setters instead of the way that we did it in program before, just assigning the value directly to it. Okay, so I'm going to leave author and price the way it is, but I'll change the title. So I'm going to say book dot, and I'll say set title intro to C#. And then let's just output it so that our program does something. Book dot get title. And this is just going to return the value of the title. I'm going to take out the breakpoint so we can just run it. And we should see now it outputs the value of that property. So that's kind of the basic adding a class. What is it? Well, we're creating our own data type. It can have multiple values. Unlike what we saw with arrays, a class can have values of different types. So here we have a string and a double, and it's being saved inside the same object. We've got this constructor method. In our case, we're not sending in any parameter values or any arguments when we call it. But the nice thing, the convenient thing about a constructor method is now we could define one that has parameters in it. So we can say public book string title, string author, and now we can say this dot title equals title, this dot author equals author, and now when we create the object, just going to build it. When we create the object, we can send in the author right away. So let me create a second book. And this time, this neat feature of Visual Studio, if you type the open parenthesis of a constructor method, or any method for that fact, you can see all the different versions. So here we've got the title and the author. So that, and so now with this custom constructor method, now we've actually initialized or assigned values to title and author the moment that we create the object. So we don't need these separate lines later on. We've also practiced a concept called constructor method overloading. You remember from the methods lesson that we can create two methods with the same name as long as they have a different signature. Meaning, there's a different number or number and type of parameters. So this is one version of the book constructor method. This is a second version because this one has 0 parameters and this one has 1 string followed by 1 string parameters. So they have different signatures. So this is the concept called constructor method overloading. Version 1 of the constructor method, version 2. Here we call version 1, and C# knows to call version 1 because there's no parameters or no arguments sent in. And it knows to call the second version because we're sending in 2 string values. So that's constructor method overloading. One more other concept I wanted to mention is composition. And composition is a really simple idea. The idea is here we have 4 properties which are simple types, string, double, and so forth. If instead of a simple type, if we created an object here, so say pretend like we had an author object set up, we could say author, and then in our constructor method we would say author equals new author. It's going to show error messages because author author is not going to let me type that because of our property. So pretend like we had an object called author with details about the author. Because we have a property of the class, which is an object of another type, now we're using something called composition. So composition just means we have a property in the class that utilizes a different class's code. Okay, it's a real simple concept. I'm going to take this out since it's not actually implemented. And that's it. So class, we can add properties, we can add methods, constructor methods, which are called when we create the object. Here we declare the object, and here's where we create it using the constructor method. We can assign properties from a different class as long as the property is considered is defined as a public property. And that's the idea behind information hiding. Maybe we don't want users to modify ISBN when they're running the code. It could also be because we have some very sophisticated code running. Maybe multiple methods are called within a method. And there's some of those methods we don't need the user to really take a look at. So in that case, we could make it private, and then they can't get to the method, maybe run some harmful code. So that's about it. If you have any questions, let me know right away. I'd love to help you out through the last couple weeks here. I know with the coronavirus, a lot of you are struggling to keep up with the work, and that's okay. If you need a little extra time, we can work something out. Just make sure that you send me an email before the semester ends so we can talk about that. And also, just as a note, in the labs this week, I've included some resources that you can go directly to for the questions. I know it's going to make it a little easier. I hope you do read the content. I tried to select content which I thought was useful, and I really want you guys to learn this stuff more than anything. And remember, the key to learning this stuff is to practice. So while I've given you an example of book, and the lab is to create a book class, I hope it doesn't stop there. I hope that you'll look at some online resources or think of your own classes to try out and keep practicing the concepts, because that's really what's going to make you a good programmer. Okay, thanks.